The lights in the Manhattan event hall cast a warm glow over the stage, where a panel of political commentators, journalists, and media personalities sat in polished chairs, microphones clipped neatly to their lapels. The evening had been billed as a lively discussion on the intersection of politics, media, and pop culture. An opportunity for the industry's sharpest minds to weigh in on the latest controversies gripping the nation. It was a full house. Hundreds of attendees, a mix of journalists, young professionals, and social media influencers, packed the room, eager to hear the panelists dissect the latest headlines. The atmosphere was electric, part intellectual debate, part entertainment spectacle. But no one in the audience expected that by the end of the night, the most talked about moment wouldn't come from a heated political exchange or a bold policy take. It would come from an offhanded joke, one that would set the internet ablaze. Among the panelists was a well-known liberal journalist, famous for their biting wit and no-holds-barred criticism of conservative figures. With a career built on sharp-tongued commentary, they had cultivated an audience that thrived on their ability to skewer the right-wing elite. They had mocked politicians, exposed media bias, and taken jabs at everyone from former presidents to cable news hosts. But tonight, their target was different. The discussion had turned toward political dynasties, how certain families seemed to dominate the headlines for years, how legacies shaped public perception. The journalist, leaning comfortably in their chair, took a sip from their water bottle before flashing a knowing smirk. And then, of course, we have the youngest Trump, Barron. Poor kid. I mean, growing up in a golden tower must be exhausting. Choosing between caviar and lobster for dinner? The struggle is real. A wave of laughter rippled through the room. Some chuckled reflexively, caught up in the rhythm of the conversation. Others hesitated, unsure whether it was appropriate to laugh at a young man who had largely stayed out of the public eye. But the journalist, emboldened by the reaction, pressed forward. Seriously, what kind of hardship could Barron Trump possibly have faced? Did his private school have a shortage of chauffeurs? Did he ever have to suffer the horror of wearing last season's designer? The laughter was louder now, some genuine, some nervous. The journalist leaned back, satisfied. In their world, this was just another joke, another punchline to toss into the whirlwind of late-night talk show, humor, and social media soundbites. But beyond the walls of the auditorium, a different reaction was unfolding. Within minutes, clips of the remark surfaced on Twitter. A journalist from an opposing network tweeted the segment with a single word. Really? The post exploded. Comments flooded in, some defending the joke as harmless satire, others condemning it as an unnecessary attack on a young man who had never engaged in public life. Even those critical of the Trump family voiced their discomfort. Mock the father all you want, but Barron? This is low. It's always leave kids out of politics until it's a Trump kid. Disgusting. If this was a liberal politician's child, the outrage would be nuclear. What had begun as a passing remark was now a full-blown controversy. The journalist, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing online, continued the discussion as if nothing had happened. But the fallout was only beginning, because what no one expected, what no one could have predicted, was that Barron Trump himself would respond. And when he did, it would silence the room. The backlash online was immediate, but inside the Manhattan event hall, the mood remained unchanged. The journalist, still reveling in the moment, had moved on to another topic. The panel continued, and the crowd, for the most part, followed along. But backstage, something unexpected was happening. A quiet discussion was unfolding among the event organizers and media personnel. Someone had shown Barron Trump the clip. Unlike many public figures who might have chosen to ignore it, dismissing it as another example of media bias, Barron made a decision that no one saw coming. He asked for the microphone. The request sent a ripple of confusion through the organizers. Was he serious? The son of the most controversial political figure in modern history, a young man who had spent years avoiding the media spotlight, now wanted to step onto the stage, not with a statement prepared by publicists, not with a calculated PR move, but to speak directly on his own terms. There was no time for strategizing, no carefully crafted speech, no teleprompters. Just a 19-year-old stepping into the public arena for the first time in his life. Not because he was forced to, but because he chose to. A few minutes later, the doors at the side of the stage opened. The murmurs in the audience started before people even realized what was happening. As Barron Trump walked toward the podium, the laughter that had filled the room earlier faded into stunned silence. He was tall, towering in fact, his presence commanding in a way that was almost disarming. He wasn't the awkward boy people had last seen in scattered paparazzi shots. He was confident, composed, and as he took the microphone, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The journalist who had made the joke shifted uncomfortably in their seat. This wasn't supposed to happen. Barron Trump wasn't supposed to respond, but he did. He looked at the audience, then at the journalist, before finally speaking. "I get it," he said, his voice steady but firm. "My last name makes me an easy target. It always has. People assume they know me because of who my father is, because of where I grew up, because of what they think my life has been like. But let me tell you something most people don't know." The room was dead silent. Being part of a famous family doesn't mean you don't have struggles. It just means your struggles come with extra scrutiny. People forget that I was a child when my father was elected. I was 11 years old when the world started calling me names, turning me into a political punchline. I learned early on that people would judge me not for who I am, but for what they think I am. He paused. Even the journalist who had mocked him was now avoiding eye contact. "I've heard it all. Barron Trump must be spoiled. Barron Trump must have it easy. You think money shields you from judgment? You think privilege erases pain? Try growing up in a world where people don't see you as a person, just as a symbol, a caricature." His voice never wavered, but there was something deeper in his tone, a rawness, an honesty that couldn't be dismissed. "My mother, an immigrant, was treated like she didn't belong in this country. My father, whatever you may think of him, faced relentless attacks every day. And he let out a breath, shaking his head. "I was just a kid trying to figure out who I was, while the world had already decided for me." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. "But here's the thing. I don't need pity. I don't need sympathy. What I need, what we all need, is for people to remember that last names don't define a person. Headlines don't define a person. And cheap jokes, they don't define a person either." There was no anger in his voice, no aggression, just truth. And it was far more powerful than any scripted response could have been. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The audience, the panelists, the journalists who had started this all, no one moved, no one spoke. Then slowly, a few people began to clap. It wasn't the forced, obligatory kind of applause that often followed political speeches. It was real. It was earned. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet. The journalist who had mocked him sat frozen, their earlier confidence replaced with something else entirely. Regret. Because in that moment, it was clear. They hadn't humiliated Barron Trump. They had given him the opportunity to redefine himself in front of the world. And he had done it flawlessly. The applause didn't die down immediately. It lingered, growing in waves, rippling through the crowd like an unspoken acknowledgement that something rare had just happened. Barron Trump, the young man who had been a mystery to the public for years, had stepped out of the shadows and, in a matter of minutes, rewritten the narrative that had long been forced upon him. Even those who had dismissed him as nothing more than a product of privilege found themselves reconsidering. He hadn't responded with anger, nor had he played the victim. He had spoken with a kind of raw honesty that shattered every preconceived notion about him. The journalist who had made the joke, once so smug, so certain that Barron was just another easy target, sat frozen, their earlier confidence wiped clean. For the first time that evening, they weren't the one holding the attention of the room. The smirk they had worn so easily minutes before had disappeared, replaced by a stiff, uneasy expression. They had underestimated him. Everyone had. But Barron wasn't done yet. As the applause finally settled, He looked out at the audience once more, scanning the faces before him. "I don't blame anyone for assuming they know me," he said, his voice softer now but no less certain. "For years I let other people define me. I stayed quiet because I thought that was easier, because I thought if I spoke, no one would really listen. But I see now that silence doesn't protect you. It just gives people permission to write your story for you." A murmur moved through the crowd. He wasn't just talking about himself anymore. He was speaking to anyone who had ever been labeled before they had the chance to define themselves. "I know I'll never change the minds of everyone, and that's okay. But I hope that, at the very least, people start to realize that no one, no matter their last name, should be judged before they've had a chance to speak for themselves." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And then, with the same quiet composure that had stunned the audience into silence, he did something no one expected. He turned to the journalist, the very person who had mocked him, and extended his hand. It was not an act of weakness, it was a statement that said, "I am bigger than your insult. I will not be defined by your joke. I will not stoop to the level you expected of me." The journalist hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Then awkwardly, reluctantly, they took his hand. The handshake was brief, but its message was undeniable. Barron Trump had not only risen above the insult, he had turned it into a moment of undeniable dignity. By the time Barron left the stage, the entire tone of the event had changed. Conversations that had once been laced with political cynicism now carried something else: respect, curiosity, perhaps even admiration. But it wasn't just the audience in that room that felt the impact. Within minutes, social media was ablaze, not with mockery but with praise. The clip of Barron's speech spread like wildfire, reshared by conservatives and liberals alike. "I never thought I'd say this, but Barron Trump just humbled an entire room. No matter your politics, that was one hell of a response. He didn't have to do that, but he did, and he did it with more class than half of Washington." News outlets that had once ignored or trivialized Barron suddenly found themselves covering him seriously for the first time. Political commentators who had written him off as irrelevant now dissected his words with the same intensity they reserved for seasoned public figures. Even critics who had long dismissed the Trump name struggled to spin the moment into something negative. Because the truth was undeniable. Barron had stood on that stage not as a political extension of his family, not as an entitled son of a billionaire, but as an individual. And for the first time, the world saw him for who he truly was. By the next morning, the journalist at the center of the controversy issued a formal apology. Some believed it was genuine, others saw it as damage control. Either way, it didn't matter, because by then, the story wasn't about the insult anymore. It was about the response. For years, Barron Trump had been little more than a shadow in the public eye, an enigma, a mystery, a name without a voice. That night, he changed all of that. And as he walked away from the stage, no cameras trailing him, no media advisors whispering in his ear, one truth remained. He had spoken, and the world had finally listened.